When scientists who study family trees traced 7 separate family lines back to a single woman in rural Kentucky, they discovered something that shouldn't exist in 1900s America. Her name appeared on birth records for over 30 years, always listed as mother, never as family. What they found in the basement of an old, empty mining company office would change everything historians thought they knew about forced pregnancy in Appalachia. Before we dive into the story, I want you to think about the invisible women in history, the ones whose pain was filed away in dusty old records, whose voices were purposely silenced by those in power. If you believe these histories matter, if you think we owe it to people like Vera to remember what happened, click the like button and subscribe. Drop your location and the current time where you are. It's always interesting to see how many different places viewers are watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. The DNA results arrived in Sarah Mitchum's email inbox on a Tuesday morning in March of 2018, and with them came a family tree that made no sense. She'd sent in her sample to one of those ancestry websites, hoping to confirm her grandmother's stories about Cherokee heritage. Instead, the computer program that matches genes flagged 6 other users as half-siblings, people she'd never heard of, scattered across Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Ohio. Sarah called the first match that evening. Rebecca Thornyhill answered on the third ring, her voice careful. They compared family histories for an hour, finding no overlap except for one detail that stopped them both cold. Sarah's grandmother had been born in Knox County, Kentucky in 1927, so had Rebecca's grandfather just 2 years later. Both birth records listed the same woman as mother, Vera Stapleton. Within 3 months, all 7 matches had connected. They formed a private online group sharing documents, photographs, and family stories. The pattern appeared slowly, then all at once. 7 children born between 1924 and 1937. 7 different fathers listed on the birth records, all with last names tied to mining families. One mother, Vera Stapleton, a name that appeared nowhere in any of their family histories beyond those official documents. The Knox County courthouse had limited records. Fire damage in 1956 had destroyed parts of the old papers, but the population count data they could access told a strange story. Vera appeared in the 1920 and 1930 population records, living in a place called Harlan Hollow, listed as a resident of the Blackstone Mining Company settlement. No job, no family, just the note company resident written in faded ink beside her name. It was Rebecca's sister, a legal assistant, who found the first real evidence. The Blackstone Mining Company had closed in 1963, its property purchased by a larger company. During the purchase, someone had boxed up decades of company records and shipped them to a storage building outside Lexington. Most had been thrown away in the 1980s, but 3 boxes remained, labeled miscellaneous letters, gathering dust in a temperature-controlled basement alongside tax records and equipment lists. The family tree experts paid for access in September. What they found in those boxes, buried among purchase orders and worker payment lists, was a file marked personnel, special arrangements. Inside were contracts, medical records, and letters spanning 13 years. Letters written in a careful, unpracticed handwriting, receipts for payments made, and photographs of a young woman with dark hair and exhausted eyes, standing alone in front of a company house, her pregnant belly visible beneath a plain cotton dress. Vera Stapleton hadn't been an employee. She hadn't been family. The documents suggested something else entirely, something that shouldn't have been possible in America between the wars. A system, an arrangement. A woman whose body had been bought, used, and thrown away by people who believed their money gave them that right. Vera Louise Stapleton was born in April of 1908 in a cabin outside Pineville, Kentucky. The youngest of 6 children, her father, Thomas Stapleton, worked a small tobacco farm on land he'd inherited from his father. The soil was thin, the crops poor, but it was theirs. That mattered in Bell County, where most families farmed land they'd never owned. The farm records kept in the Bell County Historical Society show the Stapletons managing barely enough each season. Thomas added income with carpentry work when he could find it. Vera's mother, Ruth, took in laundry from the few families in the area who could afford to pay. In a diary entry from 1922, Ruth noted that Vera had finished 8th grade with high marks, especially in handwriting and math. She'd hoped Vera might find work as a store clerk or teacher. Then the disease came. County farming reports from 1923 document the fungal infection that swept through Bell County's Toba CCO fields that summer, destroying nearly 70% of the crop. Thomas Stapleton's entire harvest rotted in the ground. By October, the bank in Pineville held a notice to take away his farm. What happened next appears in a letter Vera wrote years later, found in the Blackstone files. Her handwriting was neat, suggesting Ruth's hopes for her education hadn't been wrong. "Papa heard about work in Knox County," she wrote. "The mining company needed help in the kitchens and laundry. He took me there himself. Thought I'd be safe in a company town. Thought they'd treat a girl right if she worked hard." Thomas Stapleton signed a work contract with Blackstone Mining on November 14, 1923, on Vera's behalf. She was 15 years old. The contract, still readable in the old files, promised room, board, and $8 monthly in exchange for housework in the company settlement. Thomas received a signing bonus of $20, enough to buy his family time before the bank took the farm. Vera arrived in Harlan Hollow 3 days later. The settlement had 62 identical houses arranged in neat rows on the hillside, a company store, a small church, and the boss's house. At the far end stood the medical office run by Dr. Howard Kelch, who'd come from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier to take care of the mining company's workers. Kelch's first medical exam of Vera, written in files labeled physical assessments, noted her height at 5 feet 4 inches, weight 118 pounds. Then came observations that had nothing to do with her fitness for kitchen work. Regular monthly cycles confirmed, hips well-shaped, no history of illness or weakness, excellent specimen. The word specimen appeared 3 times in that report. Vera was assigned a room in the boarding house where unmarried female workers lived. For 6 months, she worked in the company kitchen, rising at 4 each morning to prepare breakfast for the mining crews. She sent money home when she could. In a letter to her mother dated May of 1924, she wrote about the mountains, the constant coal dust, the way the mine whistle marked every hour of the day. She also mentioned Dr. Kelch's continued interest in her health. Monthly exams, he insisted, were company policy for all female workers. He asked questions about her family medical history, about her mother's pregnancies, about whether Ruth had experienced difficulties in childbirth. Vera found the questions odd, but assumed this was how company doctors worked. She'd never seen a physician before coming to Harlan Hollow. In June of 1924, Kelch called Vera to his office outside her scheduled exam. Waiting there was Graham Torrance, the mine foreman, and his wife Elizabeth. They had a proposal, Kelch explained. The Torrances had been married 8 years without children. Elizabeth's own doctor had confirmed she would never get pregnant. They were, Kelch said, willing to pay well for a solution to their problem. Vera was 16 years old when they explained what they wanted from her. The contract they showed her promised $50, more money than she'd ever seen. Her family's farm was gone by then, sold at auction in March. Her parents and siblings had moved to her uncle's farm in Harlan County, living in his barn. $50 could change everything for them. She signed because she believed she had a choice. Because Dr. Kelch promised her it was legal, proper, done quietly. Because the Torrances seemed kind and Elizabeth cried when she thanked her. Only later would Vera understand that the exam findings, the monthly tracking, the careful note-taking had all been leading to this moment. That Dr. Kelch had been evaluating her for baby-making ability from the day she arrived, that she'd been selected. The document Vera signed in Dr. Kelch's office that June afternoon looked official, typed on Blackstone Mining Company letterhead with spaces for 3 signatures. Graham Torrance signed first, his handwriting confident and sprawling. Elizabeth signed below him, her hand shaking enough that the ink blotted. Vera made her mark last, the V and S of her initials careful and exact, exactly as her mother had taught her. The contract listed terms that Dr. Kelch read aloud, though Vera struggled to follow the legal language. She would provide pregnancy services for the Torrance family. She would receive room and board in a private cottage during the pregnancy. Upon successful delivery of a living child, she would receive payment of $50. The child would be registered as Elizabeth Torrance's legal child with Graham listed as father. Vera's name would appear on the birth certificate as biological mother, but she would give up all parental rights immediately upon birth. Dr. Kelch promised her the process was simple, natural. She would meet with Graham privately until conception occurred, likely within 3 months, given her youth and clear health. Elizabeth preferred not to know the specific timing of these meetings. Once pregnancy was confirmed, Vera would be moved to the cottage and excused from kitchen duties. After the birth, she would return to regular work. What the contract didn't mention was the isolation that began immediately. The next morning, Vera was moved from the boarding house to a small cottage at the edge of the settlement, past the last row of miners' homes. The cottage had one room, a narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs. No other female workers lived nearby. Dr. Kelch explained this arrangement as necessary for privacy and her own protection. Graham Torrance visited 3 evenings each week. He arrived after dark and left before dawn. He never spoke to her beyond basic instructions. The encounters lasted minutes, mechanical and silent. Vera learned to focus on the water stain spreading across the ceiling plaster, counting the cracks spreading outward like tree branches until it was over. By September, Dr. Kelch confirmed the pregnancy. Elizabeth Torrance came to the cottage that afternoon, bringing fabric for maternity dresses and a basket of apples from her own kitchen. She placed one hand on Vera's still flat stomach and cried with gratitude. "You're giving us everything," Elizabeth said, "our whole future." Vera wanted to feel good about that. She'd signed the contract willingly, understood the terms. The $50 would help her family, but something had shifted inside her the moment Dr. Kelch announced the pregnancy. Something she couldn't name. This child growing beneath her ribs wasn't hers to keep, but it was made from her body, her blood. The contract suddenly felt less simple than Dr. Kelch had promised. The pregnancy went forward without problems. Dr. Kelch examined her weekly, recording measurements and baby position in detailed charts. He seemed pleased with her cooperation, often remarking on her suitability for this kind of work. The phrasing bothered her. This kind of work, as if she'd been hired for a job rather than doing a single favor for a desperate couple. In March of 1925, Vera delivered a healthy boy in the cottage with Dr. Kelch attending. Elizabeth and Graham waited in the next room. The moment the infant cried, Elizabeth rushed in and took him from Dr. Kelch's hands before Vera could see his face clearly. Graham counted out $50 in $1 bills onto the table, the bills crisp and new. They named him Daniel. Vera heard this from one of the kitchen workers 3 days later when she returned to her duties. She'd been moved back to the boarding house, the cottage already cleaned and emptied of any trace she'd been there. Her body ached, milk leaking through the binding cloth Dr. Kelch had wrapped around her chest. But the money was real, tucked into an envelope she'd already addressed to her mother. She believed it was finished, one deal completed. She could return to normal life now, save her wages, perhaps move somewhere else eventually. Then in May, Dr. Kelch called her back to his office. Waiting there was another couple, the assistant superintendent and his wife. They'd heard about the arrangement from the Torrances. They had their own troubles conceiving. They were prepared to offer $60 this time. The mining company, Dr. Kelch explained, wanted to help its valued employees build families, and Vera had proven herself remarkably well-suited to providing that help. He smiled when he said it, already sliding a new contract across his desk toward her. She understood then this wasn't finished. This was only beginning. Vera refused the second contract. She told Dr. Kelch she needed time to recover, that she wanted to work and save money for a while. He nodded understandingly and let her leave his office. 2 weeks later, the Blackstone Mining Company informed her that her wages would be reduced from $8 monthly to $3. Housing costs, they explained, would now be taken from her pay. So would meals from the company kitchen. The math was simple and cruel. $3 minus $2 for the boarding house room minus $1.50 for food left her with nothing. When she protested to the person who paid wages, he shrugged and showed her the updated contract she'd supposedly signed, her initials appearing next to changed terms she'd never seen. The handwriting looked enough like hers that she couldn't prove otherwise. She signed the second pregnancy contract in July of 1925. The assistant superintendent's name was Paul Drummer. His wife Catherine never came to the cottage, never brought gifts or cried with gratitude. Vera carried their child in the same isolated cottage, delivered a girl in April of 1926, and received $60 that immediately went to cover debts the company claimed she owed for medical care. The The pattern established itself with mechanical efficiency. Between 1926 and 1933, Vera bore 4 more children for 4 different families within the company leadership. Each arrangement was documented in contracts that grew more detailed, more legally binding, more impossible to refuse. Dr. Kelch kept extensive medical files, tracking her monthly cycles, her fee, our tile windows, her recovery times between pregnancies. The company's control over the settlement made resistance unthinkable. Every house, every job, every scrap of food came from Blackstone mining. The nearest town was 8 miles away over mountain roads that became impossible to pass in winter. No bus service ran to Harlan Hollow. Letters to her family were processed through the company post office. Vera learned not to write anything that might prevent delivery. She tried leaving once in the autumn of 1928, between the 3rd and 4th pregnancies. She packed her few belongings and walked down the mountain road at dawn. By noon, a company truck had caught up with her. The driver was polite but firm. Mr. Kelch was concerned about her health. She needed to return for a medical evaluation. There were contracts to fulfill, obligations to honor. Back in Harlan Hollow, Dr. Kelch explained the reality of her situation with cold precision. She owed the company money for housing, food, and medical care that exceeded anything she could earn through kitchen work. The pregnancy contracts were the only way to clear these debts. Besides, if she left, the company would be forced to contact authorities about the nature of her previous arrangements. Surely she understood how that would look. A young woman trading her body for money. There were laws about that sort of thing. The mine foreman's wife, Elizabeth, sometimes stopped Vera on the settlement paths, young Daniel walking beside her in careful shoes. Elizabeth always smiled, always thanked Vera again for the gift of motherhood. Daniel had his father's eyes, Elizabeth said. He was so bright, so healthy. Did Vera want to know about his schooling, his interests? Vera learned to say no, to keep walking, to not look at the boy's face too carefully for features she might recognize. By 1932, everyone in Harlan Hollow knew about Vera's situation, though no one spoke of it directly. The other women in the boarding house avoided her. Miners' wives crossed the street when they saw her coming. She'd become something shameful, something that existed outside normal social boundaries. The company's arrangement had transformed her into property that produced valuable goods, and everyone understood their own survival depended on not questioning how the company managed its property. Dr. Kelch's records from this period, kept in the old files, show his growing confidence in the system he'd created. He wrote to mining company executives in Pennsylvania describing the program's success. 5 healthy children born to valued employees, 0 medical problems, minimal costs, maximum privacy. He suggested the model might be copied in other isolated company settlements, where infertility affected worker morale. Vera's own writings from these years, found tucked between the medical files, tell a different story. Brief notes scrawled on scraps of paper, hidden away because she had nowhere safe to keep a proper journal. Felt the baby move today, one reads. Have to remember it's not mine to love. Another dated December of 1931. Saw Mary at the store with her mother. She has my hands. Nobody else notices. By 1933, Vera had given birth to 6 children. She was 25 years old and had spent nearly half her life pregnant. Her body bore the piled-up damage of repeated pregnancies without proper recovery time. But the worst was yet to come. The Great Depression had reached even isolated Harlan Hollow, and desperate times made people cruel in ways good times never could. The coal market collapsed in 1933. Blackstone Mining cut production by half, laying off 60% of its workers. Families who'd lived in company houses for decades found themselves kicked out with 3 days' notice, their belongings piled in the road while they scrambled to find relatives who might take them in. The ones who kept their jobs accepted wage cuts that left them earning barely enough to cover company store prices, which never decreased despite the economic disaster surrounding them. Vera watched families pack their belongings into wagons and wondered why the company kept her. She hadn't been pregnant in 8 months, the longest gap since 1925. Dr. Kelch's exams had become less frequent. She'd begun to hope carefully and quietly that perhaps the arrangements had finally ended, that the Depression had made even this exploitation too expensive to maintain. Then in February of 1934, Dr. Kelch called her. The superintendent himself sat in the office, a man named Richard Vance, who transferred from a Pennsylvania operation the previous year. He spoke to her directly for the first time, his voice carrying the clipped efficiency of someone used to managing property. Two families had approached the company. Both had lost children to scarlet fever the previous winter. Both wanted replacements quickly while they were still young enough to raise them properly. The company, Vance explained, was prepared to make these arrangements happen at reduced rates given the economic circumstances. $75 per child with pregnancies to proceed one after another to maximize efficiency. Vera said she needed rest. Her last delivery had been difficult, leaving her weak for months. Dr. Kelch looked at his charts and disagreed. Her recovery time had been adequate. Besides, the alternative was being released from company employment entirely. Where exactly did she plan to go with no money, no family willing to harbor her shame, no skills beyond kitchen work that dozens of unemployed women could perform? She signed both contracts that afternoon. The first pregnancy began immediately with a man named Thomas Rigby, whose 4-year-old daughter had died choking on diphtheria-caused swelling. His wife hadn't spoken since the funeral. Vera delivered their replacement daughter in November of 1934, 3 weeks premature, but healthy enough. She held the infant for perhaps 30 seconds before Mrs. Rigby took her away, pressing the baby to her chest and sobbing into the blanket. The second pregnancy started within a month. No recovery period, no time for her body to heal. Dr. Kelch said wartime nurses had proven women could endure far worse than back-to-back pregnancies. The human body was remarkably tough when properly motivated. This time the father was James Hawthorne, the company store manager. His twin sons had died of pneumonia in January. His contract specified a male child only, with an unusual clause that if Vera delivered a girl, she would be required to try again at no additional cost. Dr. Kelch assured her that sex selection wasn't scientifically possible, but Hawthorne had insisted on the language anyway. She delivered a boy in September of 1935. The labor lasted 19 hours and left her bleeding badly enough that Dr. Kelch had to pack the wound with gauze and keep her sedated for 2 days. When she finally returned to consciousness, he stood beside her bed holding a syringe. Vitamins, he explained, to help her recover faster. She was too weak to resist the injection. Within 3 days, she felt strong enough to walk. Within a week, Dr. Kelch pronounced her fit for light work. Within 2 weeks, she understood the injection hadn't been vitamins at all. She was pregnant again. No contract this time, no payment promised. Dr. Kelch showed her the medical bills from her complicated delivery. Thousands of dollars in company debt now attached to her name. This pregnancy would clear half of it. Perhaps one more after that, and she'd finally be free of obligation. Vera knew he was lying. The debt would never clear. There would always be another family, another contract, another reason the company couldn't let her go. She was 27 years old and had carried 8 pregnancies. Her teeth were loosening from calcium loss. Her back ached constantly. She saw gray threading through her dark hair when she glimpsed herself in the boarding house mirror. In November of 1935, a county public health nurse named Dorothy Brennan arrived in Harlan Hollow as part of a Great Depression-era rural health program. She spent 3 days examining miners' families, checking children for malnutrition and bone disease. On her final afternoon, someone told her about the woman in the cottage who was always pregnant but never kept her babies. Dorothy found Vera alone, 7 months into the unauthorized pregnancy, heating water on the cottage stove. The nurse asked careful questions. Vera answered carefully, aware that Dr. Kelch would hear about this visit within hours. Dorothy took notes, her face growing increasingly troubled. Before she left, she promised Vera she would file a report with the county health department. These arrangements sounded irregular, possibly illegal. Someone needed to investigate. Dorothy Brennan's report, typed on official letterhead and dated November 23, 1935, still exists in the Kentucky State Archives. It describes unusual living arrangements and concerning medical practices. It recommends immediate investigation by state authorities. In the margin, someone has written a single word in pencil, filed. No investigation ever came. Vera delivered the unauthorized child in February of 1936, a girl born silent and blue. Dr. Kelch worked over the infant for 20 minutes before she drew breath, her cry weak and gasping. The company engineer and his wife took her anyway, grateful for any child after 12 childless years. They paid $40 instead of the usual $75. Damaged goods, Kelch explained to Vera later, commanded lower prices. For 4 months, the company left her alone. She worked in the kitchen again, her hands moving through familiar tasks while her mind stayed carefully empty. The other workers had stopped trying to speak to her years ago. She existed in a bubble of silence, visible but untouchable, a reminder of what happened to women who became too useful to the company's interests. In June, Dr. Kelch called her in for what he termed a knee examination. She knew better by then. Routine examinations always came before new contracts. But this time, he told her something different. The company had decided her services were no longer required for pregnancy purposes. She was being reassigned to permanent kitchen duty at standard wages. She could even move back to the main boarding house if she wished. Vera didn't believe him. She waited for the condition, the catch, the new form of exploitation. But days passed, then weeks, and no summons came. She began to think perhaps her body had simply worn out, become too unreliable for the company's purposes after 9 pregnancies in 12 years. Perhaps they'd found someone younger, healthier, more profitable. Then in September of 1937, everything fell apart. The wife of the mine superintendent, a woman named Margaret Vance, came to the kitchen in tears. She'd been trying for a child since her marriage 8 years earlier. She'd heard about the arrangements, knew the company had made them happen for other families. She was begging now, just one chance, one pregnancy. She'd pay double the usual rate, $150. She'd make sure Vera received the best care, the finest food, anything she needed. Vera said no. The refusal shocked them both. Margaret left but returned the next day with her husband. Richard Vance didn't beg. He reminded Vera of her accumulated debts, her lack of alternatives, her position as company property in all but legal name. He reminded her that women who refused reasonable work assignments could be put in institutions for mental instability. Knox County had an asylum. The conditions there were reportedly quite harsh. She signed the contract on September 18th. Margaret Vance visited the cottage weekly with gifts and gratitude, just as Elizabeth Torrance had done 13 years earlier. The pregnancy seemed normal at first. Dr. Kelch's exams showed healthy development. Vera felt the child move with the same strange mixture of attachment and forced detachment she'd experienced 8 times before. The labor began on June 4, 1938, 3 weeks before the expected date. It started normally, the familiar cramping pain that signaled her body knew what to do. But something went wrong quickly. The baby was positioned incorrectly, shoulder coming first instead of the head. Dr. Kelch tried to turn the infant manually, his hands inside her while she screamed. When that failed, he tried forceps, metal instruments that tore tissue and caused bleeding he couldn't control. 23 hours after labor began, Vera delivered a boy. He lived for 6 minutes before his breathing stopped, his tiny lungs too damaged by the traumatic birth. Margaret Vance held the body and cried while her husband stood silent in the corner, his face unreadable. Vera bled heavily for 2 days. Dr. Kelch gave her blood from 2 minors, neither of whom were tested for compatibility. She developed fever, then infection. For a week, she drifted in and out of consciousness, while Dr. Kelch pumped her full of sulfa drugs and changed bandages that came away soaked red. When the fever finally broke, Dr. Kelch told her she'd survived. Then he told her what he'd done to ensure she survived. During the worst of the bleeding, he'd made a surgical decision. Her uterus had been too damaged to save. He'd removed it entirely along with other structures he considered non-essential. The operation had saved her life, he insisted. She should be grateful. Vera was 29 years old. She'd carried 10 pregnancies. 7 had resulted in living children who called other women mother. 2 had died within hours of birth. 1 had lived for 6 minutes in Margaret Vance's arms. And now her body could never create life again. Dr. Kelch performed the sterilization without her knowledge or permission, but he documented it carefully in his files. The surgical notes, still kept in the archives, list the procedure as therapeutic intervention, medically necessary. The consent form bears Vera's signature, though she has no memory of signing it, and the handwriting doesn't match her careful script. The company kept her on anyway. There was still kitchen work after all, still floors to scrub and laundry to wash, still debts to repay through wages that never quite covered living expenses. She was no longer profitable, but she remained property. Vera spent the next 17 years in Harlan Hollow, working positions that kept her visible but powerless. She cooked meals for minors who wouldn't meet her eyes. She stocked shelves in the company store where women she'd never spoken to bought flour and sugar for families that included children with her blood. She cleaned the boarding house rooms where younger women slept, women who'd been warned in whispers about what cooperation with Dr. Kelch's requests might lead to. The settlement had changed by the 1940s. Wartime demand brought new minors, new families, people who'd never known Vera's history. To them, she was simp. Like the quiet woman who worked kitchen shifts and kept to herself. But the older residents remembered. Their silence around her became its own form of acknowledgement, a collective agreement not to name what everyone knew. Daniel Torrance turned 16 in 1941. Vera saw him sometimes at the store, tall like his father with the dark hair she passed to him. He worked summer shifts at the mine, saving money for college. Elizabeth still brought him by the store occasionally, still thanked Vera with her eyes across the counter for a gift given 16 years earlier. Daniel never knew. He bought his cigarettes and candy, counted his change, left without recognizing the woman who'd carried him. Mary Drummer was 13 by then, helping her mother, Catherine, with shopping. She had Vera's hands exactly, long fingers and narrow palms. Once, reaching for a tin of beans on a high shelf, Mary asked Vera for help. Vera handed it down and their fingers touched briefly. Mary smiled and said, "Thank you," the first words any of Vera's biological children had ever spoken directly to her. Vera nodded and turned away before the girl could see her face. She began keeping a journal in 1943, hiding it beneath the floorboards of her boarding house room. The entries were brief, observations written in the careful handwriting her mother had taught her decades earlier. "Saw James H. at church. He has my chin, nobody else notices." Another, Elizabeth brought the twins by the store. "They're 5 now, beautiful boys, I made sure someone else helped her." The twins were from her 4th pregnancy, delivered to a bookkeeper's wife in 1930. They'd grown healthy despite their premature birth. Red-haired boys who chased each other through the settlement paths. Vera had learned not to watch them too closely, not to let her gaze linger when they played outside the company store. People might notice. People might ask questions she couldn't safely answer. By 1947, 3 of her biological children still lived in Harlan Hollow. The others had moved away with their families, following work to other mining towns or cities where wartime factories still needed workers. She'd memorized their birthdays but never acknowledged them. June 2nd, November 18th, April 9th, September 23rd. Dates that meant nothing to anyone else, but marked the moments her body had fulfilled its purpose and then been emptied again. Dr. Kelch retired in 1949. A younger physician replaced him, a man who knew nothing of the arrangements and wouldn't have believed them if told. The medical files disappeared from the office, boxed up and shipped wherever Kelch went in his retirement. Vera felt their absence like a weight lifted, but also like evidence destroyed. If the files were gone, had any of it really happened? Could she prove it if she needed to? The company's store manager position changed hands in 1951. The new manager, transferred from a Virginia operation, actually spoke to Vera, asked her name, her history with the company. She gave him the simplest version. Hired in 1923 for kitchen work, never left. He seemed to find this admirably loyal. He gave her a key to open the store early, a small responsibility that felt strange after decades of having none. Sometimes she unlocked the door at dawn and stood alone among the shelves, surrounded by goods stamped with the Blackstone Company logo. Everything in Harlan Hollow belonged to the company: the houses, the church, the school, the land itself. The people too, in ways the law didn't quite recognize but everyone understood. She'd learned that truth at 16 and spent her entire adult life proving it. In the spring of 1954, Vera developed a cough that wouldn't clear. The young doctor diagnosed pneumonia and prescribed rest, but rest didn't help. By summer, the cough produced blood. By autumn, she could barely climb the boarding house stairs. The doctor changed his diagnosis to tuberculosis, then to something worse. Her lungs were scarred, he said, from years of coal dust exposure that women weren't supposed to experience because women weren't supposed to spend 30 years in mining settlement kitchens. She died on December 7, 1954, in the boarding house room where she'd lived between pregnancies. She was 46 years old. The company paid for a plain coffin and burial in the settlement cemetery, a small plot at the edge of the property where miners who died without family were buried. No stone marked her grave. The company record book noted her death with the same shortness it had noted her hiring. V. Stapleton, deceased. Account closed. 3 weeks after Vera's burial, the Blackstone Mining Company headquarters in Pennsylvania received a directive from their legal department. All worker files from before 1945 were to be reviewed for sensitive material and transferred to secure storage. The Knox County operation complied in January of 1955, boxing decades of employment records, medical files, and letters. Among those Z's were Dr. Kelch's detailed documentation of Vera's pregnancies, the contracts signed by desperate couples, and the financial records showing payments made for what the company had carefully termed gestational services. The boxes were shipped to 3 different locations. Some went to the main Pennsylvania archives. Others were distributed to regional storage buildings. The strategic scatter wasn't accidental. It ensured that no single place held the complete story, that anyone attempting to piece together the arrangements would find only fragments, disconnected pieces of a puzzle spread across state lines. The Knox County Courthouse fire of 1956 destroyed additional evidence. The blaze started in the records room where birth certificates and death records were stored. Fire investigators ruled it electrical, old wiring in an older building, but the timing was remarkable. Within 18 months of Vera's death, most official documentation of her existence had been either scattered or burned. When Blackstone Mining closed in 1963, absorbed by a larger company during industry consolidation, the remaining files became someone else's problem. The acquiring company had no interest in decades-old worker records from a closed Kentucky operation. They kept financial documents required for tax purposes and shipping lists needed for equipment inventory. Everything else, boxes marked miscellaneous, went to a commercial storage building outside Lexington. The storage company invoice, kept accidentally in tax records, shows payment for temperature-controlled space for 5 years. After that, the fees stopped. Someone made a decision that old mining company paperwork wasn't worth the annual cost. Workers were told to throw away everything except legally required documents. Most of the boxes went to a landfill in 1968. 3 boxes survived because of a filing error. They'd been labeled incorrectly during the original transfer, marked as equipment manuals rather than personnel files. When the disposal order came through, these boxes were kept while the others were hauled away. They sat untouched for 50 years, gathering dust alongside legitimately important industrial documentation. Meanwhile, in Harlan Hollow, the people who'd known Vera's story were aging and dying themselves. Elizabeth Torrance passed in 1967, never having told Daniel the truth about his birth. Graham died 2 years later. Daniel inherited their house, their savings, and a box of personal papers that included letters and photographs, but no explanation for why his mother had kept a studio portrait of a thin, dark-haired woman he didn't recognize. Catherine Drummer moved to Florida in 1971 with her daughter Mary, now a married woman with children of her own. Before leaving, Catherine burned everything she'd kept from the Kentucky years. Photographs, letters, the contract she'd signed with Blackstone Mining Company that promised her a child. She never told Mary that the woman who'd sometimes helped them at the company store was her biological mother. The secret went with Catherine to her grave in 1983. The settlement itself emptied gradually. Mining operations shifted, communities broke up, families scattered. By 1980, Harlan Hollow consisted of abandoned houses slowly collapsing into themselves. The company store sat empty, windows broken, shelves stripped. The boarding house where Vera had lived became a haven for possums and decay. The cottage where she'd carried 7 pregnancies had been torn down in 1962, the land reclaimed by kudzu and blackberry thicket. The cemetery remained, though barely. Graves sank as wooden coffins rotted. Stones tilted and cracked. The small plot where Vera lay had never been marked, and by the time historical societies began documenting abandoned mining settlements in the 1990s, No one remembered exactly where her body had been buried. The settlement had approximately 40 graves. Hers was one of 14 that remained completely anonymous. In 1997, a graduate student researching Appalachian mining communities spent 3 days in Harlan Hollow documenting the ruins. She photographed the collapsed structures, recorded GPS coordinates, noted architectural details. Her dissertation included 2 paragraphs about the settlement's history and a footnote mentioning that records had been largely destroyed in a courthouse fire. She had no idea what had happened there between 1924 and 1937. The landscape offered no clues. By 2000, even the people who'd grown up in Harlan Hollow struggled to remember specific details. When historians interviewed former residents for oral history projects, they talked about the mine, the company store, the hard winters. No one mentioned Vera. Either they'd never known her story, or they'd chosen to forget it, or they died before anyone thought to ask the right questions. The erasure was nearly complete. Vera's body lay in an unmarked grave in an abandoned cemetery. Her story existed only scattered documents that no one had reason to connect. Her biological children lived ordinary lives, most never knowing their true origins. The system that had exploited her had dissolved into corporate reorganizations and archived paperwork. She'd been made invisible, and she might have stayed that way forever if not for the science that would emerge decades later. Technology that could read truth written in blood and bone. Evidence that couldn't be burned or scattered or buried deep enough to hide. The 7 families gathered in Knox County on June 14, 2022. A date chosen because it meant nothing. None of them wanted to mark Vera's birth or death, the beginning or end of her pregnancies. They wanted a day that belonged only to remembering her as something more than a vessel, more than a systems victim, more than names on contracts and medical files. 63 people came. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of the 7 who'd survived. They brought photographs of their families, the ones built unknowingly on Vera's body. Sarah's grandmother had died in 2015, never knowing the truth about her birth. Michael's father was still living, 89 years old, struggling to process that the mother who'd raised him wasn't biologically his, that somewhere in his cells he carried the DNA of a woman used and discarded by people he'd called neighbors. The Knox County Historical Society had agreed to place a marker. Finding the exact grave proved impossible after 68 years, so they chose a spot at the cemetery's center where visitors couldn't miss it. The marker was simple granite, engraved with words the families had debated for months before reaching consensus. Vera Louise Stapleton, April 1908 to December 1954. Mother to many, honored by none until now. Her suffering was real, her humanity undeniable. We remember. Jennifer Hawthorne spoke first, her voice shaking. Her grandmother had been the 6th child, born in 1933 during the Depression years when desperation made cruelty easier. We can't undo what was done to her. We can't give her back the children she carried or the life she should have had. But we can say her name. We can make sure she's not forgotten again. They'd invited historians, journalists, and representatives from organizations that worked on reproductive rights and human trafficking. A sociology professor from the University of Kentucky spoke about company town dynamics, how isolation and economic control created conditions where exploitation became systematic. A legal scholar explained why prosecution was impossible. Everyone directly involved was dead, and successor corporations bore no legal responsibility for actions taken by dissolved entities decades earlier. But the families weren't seeking prosecution. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted Vera's story taught in schools alongside other histories of exploitation in Appalachia. They wanted her name entered into databases documenting reproductive coercion, so researchers studying these patterns would know her case existed. Her suffering had been real. Rebecca Thornyhill had brought something none of the others expected. She'd hired a forensic artist to create an age progression portrait based on the 1924 photograph found in the company files. The image showed Vera as she might have looked at 40 had she been allowed to age naturally instead of being ground down by repeated pregnancies and a lifetime of servitude. The woman in the portrait had gray streaking her dark hair, lines around her eyes, but something in her expression suggested dignity that the original photograph had lacked. They mounted this portrait beside the historical marker, protected behind glass in a weatherproof frame. Visitors to the cemetery would see not just the young girl in the company photograph, exploited and exhausted, but the woman she might have become. Sarah read from Vera's journal, the entries they'd found hidden in the storage boxes. Felt the baby move today. Have to remember it's not mine to love. The words carried across the abandoned settlement, witnessed by descendants who existed because of her body, but grew up never knowing her sacrifice wasn't voluntary. The ceremony lasted an hour. Afterward, families lingered, talking quietly among themselves, forming connections they'd never expected. They were related through trauma, through a woman none of them had known, but all of them owed their existence to. Some exchanged contact information, promising to stay connected. Others simply stood at the marker, reading her name repeatedly, trying to make real what felt impossible. Local news covered the event. The footage showed the families gathered around the marker, the portrait of Vera watching over them, the overgrown cemetery where she lay somewhere beneath their feet. The story spread through social media, shared by advocates working on reproductive justice, by historians documenting Appalachian exploitation, by People W. Ho understood that Vera's story wasn't unique, just uniquely documented. Corporate surrogacy exists legally now, regulated and contracted, supposedly protecting all parties. But the families knew the difference between choice and coercion, between women with options and women like Vera who'd had none. Her story became a measuring stick, a reminder that calling something legal didn't make it ethical, that paperwork and contracts couldn't transform exploitation into consent. Vera Louise Stapleton spent 31 years in Harlan Hollow. She bore 10 children for 7 families. She died unmarked and unmourned, erased so thoroughly that her biological descendants didn't know she existed. But DNA doesn't forget, blood remembers. And now finally, so do we. If this story has moved you, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be told and remembered, click the like button. Subscribe to this channel because there are countless other Veras whose stories remain buried in archives and forgotten cemeteries, waiting for someone to finally speak their names. We owe them that much, we owe them everything.